Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Sunday, June 23rd, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about the Donald Trump campaign announcing today that they will be expanding operations, opening up 19 field offices in Minnesota and Virginia, two states that Joe Biden won by 7.7 points in Minnesota in 2020, 10.1% in Virginia in 2020, large states for President Biden that now the Trump campaign is convinced they will be able to win in this upcoming election. Now, what I find to be the most interesting about this all is that this comes at a time when Fox News themselves releases a brand new poll that shows Joe Biden now leading Donald Trump for the first time since October of 2023, and the first time ever that on the 538 national average, Joe Biden leads Donald Trump across the national metrics. Now, announcing you are going to be expanding your electoral map simply cannot come at this point in time, just days before a presidential debate that truly could shake up the trajectory of this race. Minnesota and Virginia, while may not be the most safe Democratic states, are far from being what I would call to be in play, at least as of right now. Donald Trump has made declaration after declaration that he genuinely believes he will win the presidential election through Minnesota, he will win the presidential election through Virginia, and he honestly has been grouping it into a number of other states, including ones like New Jersey, where he says that he is going to win the Garden State that went to Joe Biden by 15 points in the last election. Donald Trump is making claims that he is all of a sudden the favorite in these states that are traditionally, sure, more competitive than most states, but are far, far, far less competitive than the states that Donald Trump made a major play for back in the 2020 election. Now, I think we really run into a problem here when the Trump campaign is focusing money and expenditures into states that just simply will not go their way in this election. I can't help but thinking about how the 2022 midterms might have gone differently had the Republican Party decided to actually hone in on the battleground states in the Senate races and governor races that actually were the most competitive. I remember, and we talked about this at length, the argument that Washington State was going to be narrowed down to being a swing state in these 2022 midterms. We were promised by Real Clear Politics that showed that all of a sudden Washington was in play. Trafalgar, which used to be a major conservative polling group that has since faded off into irrelevancy after the 2022 midterms, showed us a poll that showed the incumbent Democrat there, Patty Murray, winning by a margin of less than 3 points. What happened? She ended up winning by 14 points. And national Republicans decided to invest in the race in the state of Washington. They decided to go ahead and spend money in this state. Why? They were sold on this false promise and this false idea that Pennsylvania was already going red, that Georgia was already going red, that Arizona and Nevada and New Hampshire, and that Colorado would be the dark horse state with a pro-choice Republican candidate for Senate. Republicans were convinced that these midterm elections would be a red wave, and yet they were far from it. And that's where Democrats did quite well. It feels eerily reminiscent of the 2016 presidential election when we see headlines like these of when Hillary Clinton decided to open campaign field offices in the state of Missouri. That was something. And it wasn't a decision that was made strongly. She decided to visit Missouri. She decided to make this a thing. She decided to make this a state that would be in play in this election. And maybe it made sense because a few off polls said that Hillary Clinton was down just 3 points in the state of Missouri, and they decided to focus on it. Well, guess what? No. Hillary Clinton was not going to win Missouri and ended up losing by roughly 16, 17 points. Missouri was not in contention, but just a few polls, non-high quality ones, seemed to have suggested that those states were in play. That's what's happening here. The Trump team believes at its core that they are going to win this election with no hiccups. They will win battleground states and they will expand the map. Every time we see decisions like these, I can't help but question, do they have everything all together when you look at that election? Because when you look back at the 2020 presidential in Virginia and Minnesota, it doesn't make much sense that they are investing in this state when Pennsylvania is still just a point up for President Trump. That Donald Trump is ahead in Wisconsin by 0.1, yet you're opening 19 offices in Virginia and Minnesota. Make that make sense. Virginia in 2020, Joe Biden won the state by 10.1. In 2020 in Minnesota, Joe Biden won the state of Minnesota by 7.1%. These states were not the most competitive. These states were very strong. And look at that swing from 2016. Left-leaning. Look at that swing from 2016. Left-leaning. The population drivers of these states became far more Democratic, and they are expected to stay the same in this election with maybe marginal improvements for Donald Trump. Now, this stands in direct contrast with what the Biden campaign is doing in the same time. Rather than opening up field offices in Virginia and Minnesota, which I'm sure there will be a minimal Biden presence, just on the off chance that this state does in fact become more competitive, but in fact, they are focusing on battleground states. Just recently, right before the debate, the Biden team has announced that over the next week, they will be having over 200 events in the Peach State. They are going to be going on complete defense in the state, holding community barbecues and explainers and having celebrities come down to the state and attract audiences to talk about the Biden-Harris administration and the re-election bid. Democrats know where to focus on. It gets even better for Democrats when you look at the states that they are focusing on in this election. Democrats have over $250 million to be spent on advertisement spending after Labor Day. Do you want to know where they decided to focus that money? Nevada, Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Georgia. Are they sending money down to Florida? No. Are they sending money over to other states? Comparable to Virginia, we would throw in Alaska. Alaska and Virginia had identical margins in the last election. Do you see Biden campaigning in Alaska? And sure, you could argue that maybe because Trump is up nationally, it makes sense to expand his map. But what happens when a repeat of 2020 happens, where he says, I'm up in all of these states, and it doesn't come through? Trump has lost these battleground states before by the narrowest of margins. Could you imagine how much damage that would do to Republican morale if they lost the state of Wisconsin as a tipping point state in this election by 10,000 votes? All in an effort where they spent hundreds of thousands to do rallies in Virginia and Minnesota. Each rally costs $60,000 to $70,000. Voters can be swayed in states where more advertisements are being spent in, more organizers on the ground, more field offices in states where it matters. But they're delusional in some cases. They're deluded, is what I meant to say, in the idea that they are somehow winning Minnesota and Virginia, because even back in 2016, Hillary Clinton's lackluster performance in the presidential election, Clinton won by 5.4% in Virginia. Clinton won Minnesota by 1.5%, and don't get me wrong, this was an impressive showing for Donald Trump, but he still got only 45% of the vote. This was more a problem that Hillary Clinton couldn't win that majority because voters went elsewhere rather than Donald Trump having a significant narrowing up of the state. Because based on overall performance statewide, Mitt Romney actually received slightly more votes in terms of percentage than Donald Trump in the state of Minnesota. Fast forward to 2020, Donald Trump makes an improvement of less than half a percentage point. Joe Biden gains 6 points overall. So if that tells you anything about how these states go and how these states are simply not Trump states, that should explain it. And again, I keep getting circled back to this idea of the 2016 presidential election, where the Clinton team was convinced, utterly convinced, that Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania were locked down, and it was all about expanding the map. The first woman president should come in with an electoral mandate. Democrats want to expand their seats in the Senate, and that also could explain the investments into states like Missouri, because there was a down-ballot Senate race there that arguably was far closer than many other Senate races in the country. But Virginia has Tim Kaine, and he's going to win the Senate race there quite easily. Minnesota has Amy Klobuchar. She will also win quite easily. The reason I mention that, I actually don't see a beneficial reason for the Trump team to have campaign field offices in these states. And honestly speaking, based on the electorates that these are, those Republicans are better serviced being disconnected from the Trump base rather than in line with it. Unfortunately for them, with a heavy presence of Donald Trump in the state, I just simply don't see that happening. I look at this as a maneuver that should only be coming from a ticket that genuinely is on track for an easy sweep in the election. But they aren't. But they're masquerading as such, but there are real electoral impacts of doing so. This might make Democrats bat an eye and say, why are they expanding to Virginia and Minnesota? And maybe that's part of it. Maybe the Trump team doesn't actually think they're going to win these states, but investing into them might have Democrats counteract that. but that won't happen because Democrats haven't been falling for the bait in a number of these states that Republicans are hoping that they do. When Donald Trump goes to the Bronx and says, we can win New York, you don't see Democrats flocking to open field offices in Brooklyn. You find that Democrats are still focused, hyper-focused, and fixated on the Battleground States, and CBS News released that poll just a month ago that showed Trump up by 1 nationally, but Biden up in the Battleground States. Why? Because clearly Biden is doing better in the states that he is investing in than he is nationally. Or at least you are finding that in some instances, some Battleground States actually have up Trump less than the national average, even though historically the national average has shifted more towards the Democratic Party. Republicans haven't won the national popular vote in any election in the 21st century except 2004. President George W. Bush and President Trump, both of them, won their races by losing the popular vote. And so I see this as something, again, it would make sense if this was Richard Nixon in a re-election bid. This would make sense if it was Ronald Reagan. It might have even made sense for somebody like Barack Obama, who won with 365 electoral votes in the first time. But this is a losing presidential candidate. This is Donald Trump, who lost the 2020 presidential election and won 2016 by the exact same margin. Meaning if Democrats are back there at 306, Republicans too, meaning that both of them should be investing into these, these extra states that they don't need in the election. But Biden is focused. The Democratic ticket is focused. And should the election go to Biden, we will have so many different ways to unpack the Trump campaign because they are making a number of political miscalculations. Regardless of where they are in the polls, regardless of where they are in fundraising metrics, the idea here that there is going to be somehow a red wave and they can win Minnesota and Virginia is just not grounded in reality. The Trump team, too, when you take a look at the verdict and what they thought would happen, they made a declarative ruling that he would survive any verdict. There would be zero impact in the polls. In fact, the Trump team swore up and down that it would help them. Sure, it might have thrown in some fundraising cash, but where are they spending that? Legal fees. Where is the team going to spend $108 million in Georgia, Arizona, and Wisconsin? With Turning Point Action, the same group that backed Kari Lake, Blake Masters, and Abe Hamadeh, and all the Republicans who lost statewide in Arizona in 2022. They are now solely responsible for the get out the vote method in Arizona and now Wisconsin and Georgia. $108 million. $108 million when the Trump team in total will likely raise just under $1 billion. A tenth of the campaign being spent on a wing and faction of the party that the RNC initially said, hell no. And so that faction decided to kick out the RNC chair, Ronna McDaniel, and implement Laura Trump. There are so many political miscalculations, ones that lead to this overestimation about support in the public for Trump post-verdict, that there would be no impact of this verdict, that Donald Trump will be just as fine and in fact better off if he is found guilty. We obviously know that is not the case, and we obviously know that is not what happened here. There has been movement on the national level, and when confronted with that movement, Donald Trump goes on the offense, calling Fox News' survey, which is an A-rated pollster, trash, saying it's wrong, and Real Clear Politics has me up, so therefore I am up, and that is the thinking. That is the thinking that loses elections. It is that level of complacency, it is that level of overconfidence that is the exact reason why in 2022, Democrats won. Why in 2016, Donald Trump won. The Hillary Clinton campaign came in with these blinders. Blinders propped up by being +8 in Wisconsin, +4 in Pennsylvania, +3 in Michigan, +3 in Florida, +2 in North Carolina. Within the margin of error in Georgia and Arizona. In some weird polls back in July, 3 points, within 3 points of Texas. Within 3 points of Missouri. Polls aren't always right. And while maybe they underestimated Trump in 2016, I genuinely think there's a case to be made that this election, they far underestimate President Biden in the way they far underestimated Democrats back in 2022. But the Trump team isn't ready for that because they are approaching this election as a short-up victory. And that could explain a lot of why they're slipping recently in some of these battleground states and why they are slipping on the national average. Democrats have always had a more coordinated and put-together campaign. The 2016 Trump campaign wasn't better, in theory, than Hillary Clinton's in terms of structure and fundraising and just overall support Nationally, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, but it was about luck and a perfect storm that doomed a presidential bid that began 30 years prior. This time around, Republicans don't have that perfect storm, even with an approval rating that is low and national numbers that should indicate Republicans doing far better than what they're actually doing. There are a number of missteps that are resulting in the Trump team losing, that are resulting in the Trump team right now on the 538 forecast and in my own forecast not doing too hot when it comes down to these battleground states, because they should be doing far better. And we'll see what happens. But as of right now, when more articles like these come out and more news pieces about how the Trump team is looking to expand operations, when we talk about expanding operations for Democrats in 2024, we're talking about North Carolina, a state that Biden only lost by less than 2 points. Not a state like Minnesota or Virginia where Trump lost by double digits or slightly under. Because Democrats don't do that. And it could very well pay off this election, and I genuinely think it will. And that will show, I think, Republicans potentially something to reflect on post-election. It's a mistake they made in 2020, it's a mistake they made in 2022, and it is a mistake they are making live in front of our faces in 2024. I could be wrong, though. Trump may win Minnesota and Virginia, and I could be entirely proven wrong, and that will be a further conversation about the future not of the Republican Party, but rather of the Democratic Party, if they're losing Virginia and Minnesota in this election. Because Democrats should be winning here easily, and I still think they will. It will be a question if margin narrows down, but ultimately, I see no genuine reason to invest from the Trump team in these states, and yet they aren't just investing. They're holding rallies and having combined 19 campaign field offices in states that will still vote for Biden, no matter how hard the Trump team tries. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.